Now, Paul Atreides, little Paul Atreides, I call him Pesky Paul. Pesky Paul, he says he's the Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib, little mouse, little sand mouse. And he is very tiny. I've seen him. Very tiny. Okay. I don't know if you've seen that TikTok that I was just quoting somebody on Twitter, which is how I learn about TikTok because I am an old, so I have to get all the kids' videos via clips on TikTok. But somebody on Twitter was like, post the funniest TikTok video you've ever seen, and it was just a still frame shot from the movie Dune, and a guy who was pretending to be Donald Trump, doing a Trump impression, but he had put his face onto the sandworm because it's me, Shai Hulud, your favorite sandworm, Shai Hulud. It's great, and I'll post a link to it in the comments because you got to watch it. But I did have a reason for bringing it up. What was it? Oh, right, yes, Muad'Dib. This is going to be the Muad'Dib episode of Young Heretics, and I will explain why in just a moment. I've got a ton of announcements for you guys, so do stick around until the end. Make sure you listen through to the end for a bunch of exciting stuff that's coming down the pike. I think you're going to enjoy a lot of this stuff. And I'm stoked to tell you about it, but I know you're here for the Homer. You're here for the Homer, and so am I. I'm really excited that we have made it now to the beginning of the Iliad. This is our series on Homeric poetry. It's part of our getting ready to watch this Ralph Fiennes movie that's coming out about the end of the Odyssey, but also it's Young Heretics core. This is the show about the great treasures of Western civilization. The Iliad and the Odyssey are foundation stones of Athenian and Greek literature, and Athenian and Greek literature are in turn one of the two major pillars upon which the West rests, the other being Jerusalem. You've got Athens, you've got Jerusalem, and we are here in Athens at the source with Homer, and I've been telling you all the surrounding stories, all the mythology that goes around the Iliad so that you can approach it with fresh eyes and know some of the background material that you need to be able to get into this text, because it can come barreling out of the gate without a lot of introduction, and the story is very beautiful and very exciting and fun, but sometimes it can be daunting for people, and a lot of the stuff we've been doing is just telling all the awesome other stories, the Marvel Cinematic Universe of Homer that surrounds the opening of this beautiful poem. But now I want to get into it and open up the story, start to tell you the story of the Iliad, which will lead us on, of course, into the story of the Odyssey, and complete our journey for now through the Homeric poems. I don't know about you. I don't know if you have any experience with the Iliad or with these poems. I find the opening particularly difficult to keep track of, and I've been reading this poem since I was 12 years old. I've read it a bunch of times, and every time I have to remind myself, what are all the different names? Even if you kind of know Greek names generally, it can be really tough to keep track of how this particular quarrel breaks out, because that's how the poem begins, right? Book 1, we open with the rage of Achilles, sing goddess the rage of Achilles, how they quarreled, and then we jump right into how was it that Achilles and Agamemnon got into this fight. Last week I kind of told you about the stakes of the fight, the glory that Achilles is here to win and what that would mean in his society and in his moment and in his time. Now we have to talk about the mechanics of how the fight actually breaks out, because as I was saying last time, in these honor cultures you have these huge structures of civilization building that go out as far as human society can possibly go, but they are structured, built out of these small interactions, and so you get down to these tiny little moments where the whole of life depends on, or seems to depend on, what happens in this minute quarrel. And this is a small quarrel, and that's part of why the details can be kind of hard to keep track of. I wrote myself a little mnemonic so that I wouldn't lose track of all the different names, and I'm going to read you the mnemonic just in case it's helpful for you about how this story goes. It goes like this. Chryses asked for Chryseis. Agamemnon said no. Chryses said, Apollo, draw back your bow. Achilles called a meeting and said, Calchas, what's the deal? Calchas said, give Chryseis back. This guy's for real. So Agamemnon took Briseis from Achilles instead, and that's how Agamemnon very nearly lost his head. If that rhyme helps you, it's helped me a little bit to keep the whole story straight. So the two characters we start off with are actually not main characters in the poem. They're Chryses and Chryseis. Chryseis is the girl whom Agamemnon has taken as a war prize. And this is just part of the furniture of the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's a mistake, I think, to go looking for or even really making commentary on the virtue or morality of taking prizes and captives in war. That's not what the poem is doing with these characters. They're just there. They're just part of how war plays out, and there's a lot of sorrow and empathy, actually, in Homer for the tragedy of warfare and the casualties of it, but also a lot of realism that this is simply what's happening. These heroes are fighting, and part of what they get in exchange for defending the honor of the homeland is money, yes, fame, yes, glory, yes, but also women. And Chryseis has been taken as captive by Agamemnon, who, remember, is the king of the most powerful Greek faction, really. He's the king of Mycenae, and his forces are kind of leading the charge here, even though he's not the guy that was initially offended. Menelaus, his brother, king of Sparta, has been offended, but Agamemnon is now the head honcho, the big man, the man with the walking tall and carrying a big stick. He's got Chryseis as a war prize. Her father's name is Chryses, and this is part of why it gets so complicated. Chryses, or Chryses in Greek, and it's hard to tell them apart because this is obviously a patronymic, Chryses and Chryseis. Patronymics, also important to know about. Those are just when you get named after your father, but with a different ending. That's a patronymic. So we've got Chryses, the dad, and Chryseis. Chryses, the dad, is a priest of the god Apollo, who is one of those forces, these kind of unpredictable, terrifying forces of the real world. And I almost said a force of nature, which he kind of is, but not in the sense that we mean when we think we can domesticate through science these natural causes and effect. This is a part of the world that the Greeks, the universe that the Greeks of Homer's day see themselves as living in, which is ruled over by chaotic forces that may or may not answer to our demands. We can do things to alter or even appease them. We are in a relationship with them, but they have a being and concerns and a mind that extends far beyond the narrow limits of our own humanity. And part of the heartbreaking pathos of these poems is that that little circle of light, that human circle of civilization, only extends so far, and we don't know what's out there. Beyond there be dragons, and the gods kind of represent, in one aspect, these competing forces, but you can pray to them, and this is what's going to happen now. So Chryses comes to the Greeks. They're in council, and Chryses says, "Give me back my daughter, I beg you." He really supplicates, humbles himself before the king, and even prays that Agamemnon would win victory. So he's kind of a non-combatant here. He's not somebody that's trying to really score one for the Trojans. He just wants his daughter back. He loves his daughter. And so we have this very human drama at the center of what's going to become an enormous political and military sensation. Agamemnon is represented here as a total blowhard idiot, a blockhead. I think that's pretty unequivocal in the poem. He's the character through whom we really make our first encounter with hubris, which of course is a very, very famous Greek word that means something like defying this larger divine system of the gods and the natural world and all the powers that are greater than our own. And the idea of overshooting your human limitations is one of the ideas that obsesses Greek writers throughout, which is why we have this concept of hubris. What happens when, through momentary success or through limited success in a particular region, we begin to extend our human ambitions out beyond that little circle of light, that little huddle of humanity that we have in the midst of this dark cosmos? Well, then the gods become jealous and they strike us down, and we remind us once again of this fundamental reality, which is not the reality of the Christian universe. Remember, it's very difficult for us to think out of that way of being or way of thinking, but in the Christian universe, even if everything hasn't yet been lit up by human vision or knowledge, everything could be, because we're made in the image of God. In this early pagan universe, that's not true, even though we might be tempted to think that's true, because so much of our mind is noble, and so much of what we can discover does answer back in the world with reason and logic. And the Greeks were always in this tense battle between these two impulses: to go forth, to chart out the wheeling of the stars and understand everything and extend the human domain beyond its remit, and the fear of hubris, the warning against overextending your reach. And this is a clear instance of that. Once you know the context and understand the concerns of the writer or the author, I should say, the composer and the listener, you can start to see what Agamemnon represents and why this is such a disaster, even before he pisses off Achilles. Even before we get into that, Agamemnon is exhibiting this core human foible of hubris when he says, "You old man, never darken my door again," he effectively responds. And instantly, he makes an enemy of Chryses, which you do not want to do. He didn't want to do that because Chryses then prays to Apollo and makes a classic prayer, a classic form of prayer that we will find again and again throughout our time with these Greek poems, which is basically the tit-for-tat prayer. It's, if I ever did this, now you do that. And this will become, in Greek and Roman religion, a sort of idea of what scholars sometimes call orthopraxy, that this larger universe beyond our understanding might never fully answer to our understanding, but will deliver imperatives into the realm of our understanding. So it's like dealing with an alien species. If you remember, again, the messages that people send in the three-body problem out to faraway alien lands, we don't know what's on the other end of that chain. We don't know what's out there in the dark forest, but it can communicate back to us these particular bits of information, bite-sized parcels of information, and orthopraxy is kind of like that. You don't know always why the gods want what they want, why they're doing what they're doing, what you might need, but you can gradually learn through privileged channels what you're supposed to do, and then you can invoke that right. You can cash that check if you've behaved well, if you've followed the rules of the gods, which might not be the rules of virtue. They might be different. They might not be the human rules, but if you've sacrificed the thing and if you've done the stuff, and Chryses says, if I've thatched your roofs, if I've made roofs on your temple and I've burned the thighs of goats and bulls, now, if ever I pleased you with any of that, if any of that stuff that I kind of threw out there into the dark, any of that spaghetti stuck to the wall, now I call in a favor from Apollo, Lord of many things, Lord of music, Lord of the sun, but in this case, really Lord of the plague, because he's going to come in, he's also the archer god, and shoot his plague arrows at the Greek ranks and start to destroy the soldiers that are fighting. And I'm going to read this in a moment, but this is kind of a precursor disaster to the Achilles disaster. Even before, again, we haven't gotten into the rage yet. We've just gotten into this spat between Chryses and Agamemnon. Now Apollo's gotten involved, and we're seeing the limits of our humanity, which in the form of plague in the funeral pyres and this disaster, which is really terrifyingly described in the poem, and I'll read it to you in a second. But just to follow through to the end of this story, the next thing that happens is Achilles, who, remember, is kind of one of the smart ones. In fact, he might be the most, if not the most sensible or the most measured, but the most aware and fully enlightened or reasoned hero in the poem, with the possible exception of Nestor or Odysseus or even Hector. Achilles understands these matters, and he calls a council and says, we got to figure out what's going on here. We're dying out here. And he consults Calchas, whom I've mentioned to you earlier in one of our other episodes, because there's some possibility that lurking in the background here is an old dispute that Agamemnon has already had with Calchas. There's other myths that might be lurking, but when we play our game in the Iliad or not in the Iliad, we're not given a reason why Agamemnon is so hostile to the gods and their representatives. But Calchas reveals the truth. He says, you've got to give Chryseis back. And Agamemnon spits in his face, essentially. And finally, through persuasion and basically just the threat of insurrection and revolt, because everybody's dying, Agamemnon is led to this very bitter pill to swallow, which is a bitter pill, right? He's won this prize, he has to give it back. This is a humbling moment, and that's part of what happens with hubris, and one reason why people show hubris is they don't want to accept their limitations, they don't want to know when they've been beat, when there are powers that are greater than us. And even the Iliad itself plays with this human sense that maybe we could dominate the world, which we're going to get into later on. But for now, Agamemnon's beat, but he is going to sulk. And the next thing that happens, if you're looking for a petulant child in the Iliad, sometimes Achilles is described as this small-minded, petulant boy, essentially, overgrown teenager, just sulking in a corner. But I made a long argument last week for why I don't think that's the right reading of the poem at all. If you're looking for somebody that does exhibit those traits, Agamemnon might be the guy, because the next thing he does is really petty and vindictive. It sort of reminds me of when John MacArthur in LA, if you were in LA during COVID, you might remember that John MacArthur kept his church open when many of the lockdown orders were forcing people to close, and a lot of people were just going with the government's orders. But John MacArthur said, no, we believe that the religious obligations we fulfill by going to church are actually higher. They point us towards something more transcendent than the health of the body. And also, this virus doesn't really threaten us all that much. And we're going to keep church open. And he won court case after court case. He was constantly being harassed by the LA state. And man, it was crazy to watch how people were flocking to him, but he was just getting bothered and constantly hit with these lawsuits, and he kept winning and he kept his church open. And then finally, this was what really got me. They revoked his parking license, essentially. I forget how exactly it worked, but they were like, you can't use this parking lot anymore. They've been using forever. And that was the kind of petty garbage that this kind of Agamemnon next move reminds me of a little bit. It's like, well, if I can't beat you in the courts and I can't win here and I can't win here, I'm just going to take your stuff. I'm going to take your things. And that's what the LA government did to the church, to John MacArthur's church. That's kind of what Agamemnon does now that Achilles has humiliated him a little bit. He's shown him up to be kind of a lout, and he has forced him to give away his war prize. And this is when Achilles takes Briseis. So you can get into, and it's a fun parlor game to get into who struck who first and who should have done what when and whatever, but this is when the rubber meets the road and the crisis hits. And I've explained why that is, because this is an insult to the very thing that Agamemnon is, or that Achilles rather, is here to win. He wouldn't be here if he didn't think he could get glory out of it. And now he's being insulted without cause. He's being insulted, from his point of view at least, for no reason other than that he told the truth and that he consulted the seer and figured out what was going on and fixed the problem. Let's not forget that there's also a resolution here to the crisis that's going on. But let me read you the passage because it's really just so cool. I had a really fun time translating this passage for you guys this week. And we're here in book 1 of the Iliad. If you want a good translation, I always suggest the Robert Fagel's version, but you can get a lot of translations out there now. This is mine. There are many like it, but this is mine. And this is after Chryses has been sent away by Agamemnon, and he prays to Apollo for retribution and vengeance. Then the old man went praying again and again to Apollo, the Lord, son of Leto, the fair-haired, who gave him birth. Listen to me, this is Chryses talking now to Apollo. Listen to me, O you with your silver bow, astride Chryse and sacred Killa, ruling in power on Tenedos, Sminthian. If I ever pleased you with temple shelters or set the fatty thighs of bulls and goats ablaze, now do me this good turn and pay the Greeks back, your arrows for my tears. He spoke, and Apollo heard. Phoebus came down from the peaks of Olympus in fury, his heart ablaze and his quiver slung over his shoulder, his arrow shafts rattling against his back as he moved, furious, coming like night. And then, at a distance, away from the ships, he crouched and took aim and shot. Awful the shriek that rose from his silver bow, first at the mules and the scampering dogs, but then he let fly a tearing shaft at the men themselves. He shot, and the corpses burned by the fleet without rest. For 9 days the god's arrows shot through the ranks of the army. At last, on the 10th, Achilles called the men to assembly. I mean, I'm going to tell you some comments about it, but I might as well just shut the podcast down right now. This stuff speaks for itself, and I say that knowing that it takes a lot of background knowledge to get into it, but that's the point of the background knowledge. I always want to make sure to stress that when we do this show, because I love talking to you about this stuff, and I love communicating the great ideas in it and the history around it, and I just find it endlessly fascinating and ennobling and enriching for modern life, all that stuff. But I got nothing to add to that, man. That's just grade A blockbuster stuff. You don't improve on that. A few things that might interest you and help you to know as you get into this poem. We got a list there, and this occurs in the Iliad fairly regularly, of names, other names for Apollo. And unless you understand that's what's going on, it can be kind of confusing, sort of like when you read Russian literature and everybody has 5 different names. It's a little easier in Greek because they usually come piled on top of each other. But sometimes, like with the word Phoebus, you have to know that that's another name for Apollo. They're called epithets, these names that get added on. That's what epithet means in its Greek roots. And the one that I find particularly fun and illustrative of how these poems get passed down is Sminthian, which in the evocative Greek is Smintheo. And what I love about it is nobody quite knows what it means. There's obviously place names going on here, and one way that gods get epithets is through particular locales that worship them or might have had temples to them in Homer's day, and you get a lot of that in this prayer. But you also get this name that it's kind of anybody's guess. There's been a few different attempts to figure out. Some people say that there was a town. We do have a town called Sminthi in Troas, which is maybe what is being invoked here, and maybe that is particularly special to Apollo. Others have suggested it's from Sminthos, the mouse, which is a Greek word just meaning mouse. And we do have comparisons between gods and animals, attachments to particular animals. Jupiter has his eagle, for example. So maybe Apollo has mice. We're not quite sure, but I like that idea because it makes Apollo into the OG Muad'Dib. And that's why I started with the TikTok video. Because if you remember in Dune, Paul Atreides picks Muad'Dib, the sand mouse, as his emblem animal when he's becoming sort of gaining favor, gaining the trust of the locals on Arrakis, and everybody thinks he's joking, but then the head honcho is like, no, Muad'Dib is smart and skilled and knows where to find water and all this stuff. So I don't know, maybe there's something about that connected to Smintheus, and I definitely am going to refer to Apollo from now on as Muad'Dib. But that's really all kind of, again, background information on the way to this insane depiction of the god crouching and shooting his arrows. And you see why Achilles calls the council. What happens next is one of the most famous moments in probably all of literature, and it is the outbreak of the quarrel. And there's something really important that happens that sometimes we skip over or we forget as we move on to the rest of the poem, which is that Achilles almost kills Agamemnon right then and there. That's why my mnemonic ended with that's how Agamemnon very nearly lost his head, because he goes to pull out his sword, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, stops him, pulls him back by the hair. And this has been a significant moment basically ever since it was composed. People have commented on it for centuries, and it's still kind of fascinating because it looks very much like a picture of the spiritual reality of the scene embodied in the physical world. The symbolism is really kind of almost obvious, right? You've got this warrior, this hulking man, ready to solve his problems the way that most warriors throughout most of time have, which is through physical violence, the meeting of bone with bone and steel with flesh. But you've got this other force that comes in and restrains him by the head, which at the time of the composition was probably not the seat of thought, but there's obviously still something going on because Plato later on will talk about the head of a man as sort of representative of the logos, and so we've clearly got reason and prudence whispering into the ear of Achilles and restraining physical force by another principle that is more spiritual. And it's perfectly possible that this is a metaphor in Homer's understanding. It's perfectly possible that it's something he thinks physically happened in some way or another. It's perfectly possible that it's both, that he combines these two things in one moment. That's kind of how art works. It gives you a literal reality that is imbued with metaphor, and it's why we respond to art, because our literal reality is, I think, also imbued with metaphor. But clearly, that's what's being sort of depicted here, and this was so fascinating as an insight or a window into Greek thought that there was a famous theorist you may have heard of named Julian Jaynes, who was a psychologist actually at Princeton. And he wrote a book with one of the most gratuitous titles I've ever heard, which is The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. But although it is a mouthful, that title actually tells you everything that the book is about. It's about the linkage between the two halves of the brain, the two hemispheres that thickened and grew evolutionarily over time. And James's theory was that before that linkage was truly firm, the experience of somebody in life would have been not the experience of one unified self, but of multiple different voices speaking to each other, and that these ideas would only gain coherence in one continuous self once the mind itself was unified as a single structure. Now, I am in no way the neurobiologist who will tell you whether or not this is in any way plausible. I've heard people who know about these things saying it doesn't really add up, doesn't really stack together. But it's a beautiful theory, I think, because it gets at something true, which is that the experience of the world from one unitary perspective, with one body, one mind, whenever that came into being evolutionarily, whether it was in the moment of Homer or further back in distant ancestral memory, whenever that happened, that was in some sense the creation of man. That was the coming to being of man, and he emerges kind of in distinction against the gods through this process of discovery that the many different forces acting on him kind of come to a head in this one person. So James thought maybe the gods were a representation of the experience of the world if your reason spoke with one voice and your appetite spoke with another, and this was all kind of just a series of different experiences rather than a continuous memory-bound set of experiences and a self. And I find that really interesting. Again, I don't think it's necessary to really root it in a particular story about evolutionary neurobiology in order to understand that what you are looking at here is a depiction of the way the world feels as consciousness comes online. And I think there are other moments in the Homeric poems that seem like that to me, that seem to represent a society, whether a society of distant ancestral memory or a society that's closer in Homer's time, dealing with the advent of fully formed human rationality, that might not have been totally structured and ready to go from the jump, but might have had to come into place slowly. But once it comes into place, it's a total radical break with everything that went before. And that's, if you read G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man or Orthodoxy to a lesser extent, he has this idea too, that there must have been a time, whether it was 1,000,000 years ago or 5 minutes ago, at some point, we cross this divide, not just from one stage to the next in this gradual sequence, but from not human to human. And that's an unbridgeable gap that turns us into freestanding, coherent, logic-using, language-using selves and makes us everything that we now are as co-creators of the world, and could feasibly be represented as the advent of humanity or God making man through whatever processes it pleased him to do that. And I think there are other passages in the Iliad that actually suggest this. Like, for instance, later on, you get a moment where Agamemnon, again, foolishly, I think, tries to test the loyalty of the men by saying, we're all going home. And everybody, instead of doing what Agamemnon wants, which is saying, no, we want to stay and fight, they all split up and go running for their ships, and they have to be corralled and gathered back together by wiser heads, including Odysseus. And Odysseus, in a kind of notorious passage, goes through the ranks with a stick. And when he meets a noble-born man, he reasons with him and convinces him to get back into place. But when he meets a low-born man, he beats him with the stick and sends him back to his ranks. And you can say this is this terrible chauvinist elitist thing, or you can say maybe this is a picture, some kind of artistic picture or distant memory of a society where consciousness and rationality hadn't yet come fully online. So there were some people who still kind of operated according to the logic that would have caused Achilles to draw his sword, the logic of force against force. And now, of course, that logic remains and remains a last resort, but there's a new set of principles coming online that can contradict that. And if we allow it, can lead us up to a higher set of principles and ideals. Just a thought. One of the most rich and interesting veins to explore in this poem is, are we looking at a depiction of the advent of human reason and the imposition of its categories and its values onto a system that was previously more tribal, more physical, and even maybe closer to kind of the animal kingdom. Okay, that's the start of the poem. Now the games have begun. We're off to the races. Achilles retires and refuses to fight until he's properly honored. The war breaks out, or continues rather, because it's been going on for years and years, but the war continues and it's a disaster for the Greeks. Not only because Achilles has removed himself, but importantly because Thetis, his mother, the goddess, has implored Zeus to follow through on Achilles' threat. So Achilles has withdrawn and he thinks the Greeks are going to be sunk without him. He's right about that, but in part, it's because the heavens and the gods give assent to this. So there's always, and this is another thing the gods kind of add in, there's always an element of chance, right, in the struggle between men. It's not just down to who's the strongest guy. There's also sort of, well, will the gods favor this or that fighter? And this is represented in the poem, or expressed, described in the poem, through a series of shifting allegiances among and between the goddesses. So Thetis pleads with Zeus, gets down basically at his knees and performs a ritual act of supplication, much like the one that we've just seen in the human world. So the divine world kind of mirrors the human world in this sense, and Zeus assents and nods and says, yes, I will honor your son by allowing the Trojans to have their way. Any decision that Zeus makes here is going to get him in hot water because the gods are divided over who should win. They have different reasons, and it's interesting that this both reflects our humanity and also supersedes our humanity. So the gods are pictured as we must picture them in human society. And this is something that actually Milton will later repeat in the voice of the angel Raphael when he says, in order to depict things in heaven, I have to use your experience of human life, but we're actually talking about a realm that far expands beyond your thought. And that's also true because the gods behave in ways that show an utter unconcern for our little human lives. They have this much larger society, and yet they are invested in what goes on to a really alarming degree. So there's obviously something important about human life, even though human life doesn't exhaust the concerns, and we might not have the same concerns that the gods have about human life. The gods line up on either side of this dispute. Basically, you've got Aphrodite, Apollo, Ares, and Artemis on the Troy side. You've got Zeus sort of in the middle. Ultimately, he has this boule, which we hear about in the first line, or the first 5 lines. We hear Dios boule, the plan of Zeus is working its way out. So Zeus kind of has the full system to contend with. He's the arbiter of the whole thing, and he therefore has obligations to a kind of logic or teleology or fate or something that's beyond our full comprehension. So he doesn't really get to pick sides, but if he has a side, it's probably with the downfall of Troy, because that's what's fated to happen. Although he also has a fighter on the Trojan side, whom we'll cover in a later episode, Sarpedon, who's he's invested in because it's his son. So Zeus is like a little bit conflicted, but then Hera, Athena, Poseidon, Hermes, and Hephaestus are all pro-Greek, and obviously Thetis, the mother of Achilles. So you've got kind of this like mirror war going on in heaven that mostly takes the form of arguments and councils and disputes, but also at some points will break out onto the battlefield. Okay, that sets us up basically with all that we need, and the next thing that happens, which can be a real downer if you're just getting going with the poem for the first time, is the catalog of ships. Now, this would have slapped in antiquity. If we were ancient Greek hearers, we would have loved, we couldn't get enough catalogs of ships. Please, more catalog of the ships. As it is, it's kind of a dud. For people like me, it can be interesting and fun because it has this long and extensive kind of catalog of all the different people that came to Greece. And it's a feature of the sort of epic poetic tradition to give catalogs, to list out this long kind of expansive view of all the people. And indeed, the poet says, if I had all these different tongues, many tongues of bronze and a chest of steel, I still couldn't tell you all the Greeks that came to Troy. But I'm going to give you the Muses' report. So there is this God's eye view, this kind of helicopter pullback, camera sweeps over the entire ocean in a cinematic version, and that's, Homer's kind of grasping at that without the same technology that we have to just show you the full panorama of this army. And it shows you that the scope of this conflict, even if in its historical particulars it might have been a little local skirmish, in the narrative, it is taking on this grand epic scope. And that's part of what the catalog does, but it does bang on a little long, and you may find that this is true. The best way, I think, to get through it is to imagine yourself in a giant crowd of Greek listeners, and to think of yourself as allied to one of these little tribes, and you hear about your hometown hero, and you have this ancestral pride connected to, yeah, this guy led this force to battle. And it does also, of course, introduce us to all the Greeks, or as they're called in the poem, and as we technically should be calling them, the Achaeans, the Achaean forces, because we don't have really the concept of Greek just yet, although we do have the language of Greek, which binds all of these tribes and city-states together. But that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a coalition of city-states. We've introduced most of these main characters already. I've talked about Agamemnon a fair bit. He's the king of Mycenae. I've talked about Menelaus. He's the king of Sparta. Achilles, his guys are the Myrmidons, and once he leaves, they're led by Neoptolemus, his son, Achilles' son. Odysseus, obviously, going to have a big role to play down the line. He's the rhetorician. He's the man of twists and turns. He's from Ithaca, which is where he's trying to get back to in the Odyssey. And the only other guy that I haven't really talked about at all that I want to make sure I mention here is Nestor. So Nestor is from sandy Pylos, and he is a bit of a windbag. And this is kind of a running joke in the poem. He's the elder statesman, so he has all this wisdom. He's always talking and talking and talking and lamenting that he's not as young as he once was, doesn't have the strength he used to have, so he can't do as much battle as he would like, but he makes up for it by being sort of the OG and dispensing a bunch of really great wisdom and advice. So that's the team. It's Power Rangers assemble. It's very cool. And it would have had serious resonance for later Greeks in the classical period after the Persian Wars. Because the other thing that would have made guys stand up and cheer when the different names were announced would have been thinking of how a real coalition, not from an epic poem, but from actual recent memory, had beaten back the Persians at the beginning of the 5th century BC. Remember that we have these two big dates, 490 and 480. 490 is the first Persian War and the Battle of Marathon. 480 is the 300 Persian War with Xerxes and Leonidas and Thermopylae and eventually Salamis and Plataea and the final victory over the Persian forces, the Persian Empire. And that was famously a coalition led mostly by Athens and Sparta. And that coalition shaped politics in the Mediterranean thereafter and started to create what would be thought of as the Greek world. There were Greek-speaking peoples all over the Mediterranean. There were some that had already become part of the Persian Empire in the east. There were some that were in the mainland, some on the islands, even some colonies out further west in Italy. But the idea of a Greek identity is shaped through these kinds of wars that it's eventually going to be called a symmachia, which means fighting together. And they make these allegiances, these treaties, which are represented here in some sort of proto-form in the catalog of ships. So it's interesting for that reason too. And in that capacity, it's particularly interesting to note, if you were following along closely at home, you might have noticed one name that didn't get top billing among the kings and the places that I just mentioned, and that's Athens. Athens, which goes down later on in history as kind of the headquarters of at least intellectual culture in Greece, and today it's thought of as the pinnacle of Greek civilization. It wasn't always thought of that way, but it certainly is now. But it's kind of a minor power here in this Bronze Age representation. Sparta is ancient. Sparta is represented as going back to the Bronze Age, and they had a league of their own they were in a league of their own called the Peloponnesian League that predated the alliance against the Persians and so on and so forth. Athens really gets its prominence from the Persian Wars and proves itself in the Persian Wars. And it's after that victory that the Delian League kind of becomes the head power, which is Athens at its head, kind of running the Mediterranean. Sparta sort of doesn't want that job. Sparta says no thank you, and maybe rightly so, whereas Athens will be set on its course to kind of civilizational triumph, but also decline, and all of that later on. So you're looking at it through Homer into a world where the balance of power is slightly different, but the dynamics are very similar. And so this tells us, or would have taught the Greeks, that those kinds of alliances and balances of power could always shift, but that the Greeks themselves were strongest when they fought together. So the kind of whole game of Greek politics was going to be, can we find a way to work together as one civilization without crumbling into infighting or letting one power get too strong and exerting hubris and all this stuff. And these themes would come back again and again rooted in Homer. Everything is kind of there at the source. And all of this is in the catalog, so you should read it, don't skip it, but I understand if you find it a little boring. We then move on to Helen on the Wall, which is great, this wonderful drama of single combat between Menelaus and Paris. They try to resolve their dispute by just crowning the champion of single combat. Aphrodite messes that up by whisking Paris away, and we read the scenes in which Paris and Helen have this tortured back and forth that Aphrodite sort of presides over, in which they're reckoning with the situation that their desires, their choices, and their fate has placed them in. And we've been kind of through that, so I won't dwell on it too long. The other highlight from this kind of opening section of the poem that begins with Achilles' withdrawal and really doesn't change until, I think, the embassy and the trajectory that Achilles begins to take back into battle. The other thing to mention is Diomedes, who appears, if you've ever seen the Greek myth comics infographic of the Iliad, I will link to it. It's a fantastic resource, little sort of infographic about all the different heroes and their greatest triumphs on the battlefield and their biggest fails and all that. In the Greek myth comics version of the battlefield, Diomedes goes down as the most underrated Greek fighter, because nobody remembers Diomedes, son of Tydeus, and yet he has one of the most spectacular rampages in all of literature. The technical term for this is Greek. It's the aristeia, which means just the excellence. And sometimes characters will sort of get a power-up. They'll pick up some sort of power ring, like in a video game, and they'll sort of just go berserk or go Super Saiyan or something. Diomedes gets from Athena the power to see the gods who are currently on the battlefield, and he wounds two of them. So this is why I said that the Iliad itself kind of flirts with the possibility that human power is supposed to extend far further than it currently does, and maybe even we're capable of domesticating or overcoming the forces of nature and the divine powers that seem to rule over the world now. Maybe we're supposed to be able to overcome them. Anyway, Diomedes wounds Aphrodite and Ares, so the god of war and the goddess of love. Aphrodite is a bit of a joke. She's sort of a comic goddess, but to wound Ares is serious business, and Diomedes kind of stands in for that possibility of real human aristeia, human excellence. He kills 35 people, which I got from the Greek myth comics statistics. That's a big number for the for this poem, but then he also gives us, and this speaks to, I'll close with this speaks to the profundity of the poem, the most powerful soldier on the battlefield, at least at that moment, also gives us the interaction in which we receive the most famous articulation of the idea that mankind is just a flower in the field, kind of similar to what the prophecy of Isaiah says. And it's when Diomedes meets with Glaucus from Corinth. And Glaucus has this to say, so I've translated this passage for you as well. And this is in book 6 now. So we're on to book 6, starting at line 145. Glaucus says to Diomedes, son of Tydeus, great heart, why do you ask my lineage? They're like the leaves, these generations of men. The wind sends the dead leaves pouring onto the ground. The trees sprout more, and the flush of spring returns. So one generation is born, another passes away. That's an iconic, this is an image that will get repurposed again and again. It comes up in Dante. We've seen it in Paradise Lost. If you've been listening to my reading of Paradise Lost, it returns constantly to haunt us because it's this moment when the great hero Diomedes is confronted with his own mortality. And they go on to kind of become friends because Glaucus reveals that they have kinship ties in their distant past. So it turns out that the generations of men actually have significance that the generations of leaves don't have, and they can meet and make fellowship kind of across them. And yet the whole thing ends in this failure of an exchange for Glaucus. Glaucus has his wits taken away by the gods, and he trades bad armor for good armor just to kind of get out of the situation alive. This very ambiguous and complex encounter between the height of human excellence and the futility of human mortality, which is kind of what I've been talking about this whole time, what the poem really dramatizes in these opening battles between the Trojans and the Greeks, where the Greeks are doomed until Achilles relents and comes back in, which is what we will talk about, and how he does that is what we will talk about next time. But now I have a number of fun things to talk to you about, and I really am excited about each one of these. First of all, if you've been with the show for a while, you may remember that back in the day, I took a hiatus and a break. And I said that I was doing that to make stuff with the Daily Wire. And many of you, you've been very, very patient. Many of you have asked, what are you doing with the Daily Wire? What did you do with the Daily Wire that you went away for all that time? And I haven't really talked about a lot of the stuff that, there's been like a long period of time. Now, at last, I'm really excited to bring you a product of the work that I've done with the Daily Wire, and it's a Jordan Peterson special. So Jordan Peterson, the great beloved Dr. Peterson, has been doing this thing where he goes around the world, must be nice, right? And visits the sources of Western heritage and Western civilization. And he began in Jerusalem, and then he went on to Athens, and from there to Rome, and did this whole series. It's called Foundations of the West. And each one features a different interlocutor, a different person that talks with Jordan about the meaning and the significance of the cultural heritage in the place where he is. So in Jerusalem, he was joined by Ben Shapiro. That first episode is already out on Daily Wire Plus. And in Athens, he was joined by some guy, Dr. So-and-so, hoity-toity Greek scholar. Oh, it's me. It was me. I was there doing Athens with JP. We had a great conversation, which is now live at Daily Wire Plus. Also, I will link to it in the description of this show, and I really hope you go check it out because I think you will love it. It's just us talking in the most beautiful, perfect possible setting in the world, us talking about the logos and the power of human reason, what the Greeks understood, what they couldn't fathom or discern about revelation, and what it all means for today's civilization and our current problems and cultural decline and crisis and catastrophe. So it's Foundations of the West, yours truly with JP, and the whole series is really worth checking out. So go take a look at that. Next, I'd want to give you just a little update about my book. So a while back, I told you about my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And I am so excited for you guys to get your hands on this. There's so much in it that I think listeners of this show will love. I really hope you've pre-ordered your copy. If you haven't already, I've put a link in the show notes, and you can go and get that book now, pre-order. It's about the revelations of science and the revelations of faith and how they can actually harmonize beautifully, even though we've been taught that those two things, science and religion, intelligence and faith, are at war with one another. I think that for all the crises that I've been talking to you about on this whole show and that I wrote about in my last book, I've come to believe that the real crisis at the root of all our other crises is that we've been cut off from talking about God. And I'm not saying that to preach at you, and I'm not saying that to scold people or to say that we all need to get religion or whatever. That's not my reason for saying this. I'm saying it because I think being unable to talk about God makes us unable to talk about the most important things in life, at the center of everything, about our purpose, about our place in the universe. And a major obstacle that has been placed in our way, a roadblock, is this idea that science has disproven God or that science and religion can't be in conversation with one another. What I argue in this book is that that whole idea is not only wrong and in some sense evil, it's also wildly out of date in terms of actual science. And so I think we need a hard reset on our understanding of what science does, what it teaches, where it comes from, where it's going, and how it can be brought into conversation with faith. That's what this book is about. It's called Light of the Mind, Light of the World. And you may have noticed that we are now releasing it on October 1st. That is the honest to goodness release date, because we had to redesign the cover. And it now has this awesome cover that was designed by my friend Jonathan Hay and Cynthia Angulo. And if you haven't seen it yet, go to Amazon and check out this cool new cover for this book that I'm really excited about, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science through faith. I really hope that you will pre-order it if you haven't already, and I think for sure you are going to enjoy it a lot. Last bit of business before we do the mailbag question. Another thing I'm really stoked about, I'm teaching a college course. Class is in session. You can call me Professor Spencer. I'm teaching a class at New College, Florida, and I'm teaching it online. So if you want to audit it, you can do that from anywhere in the country. Because of the regulations and the necessity of running a state university, New College, Florida has to charge for this experience. So you do, especially if you're out of state, you will have to pay to audit the course. But what you'll get when you do that is basically a college level engagement with the text that we talk about and love on this show. I've got my reading list all laid out. I've got the books all prepared, and I'm really stoked to start next week. So if you go to ncf.edu/youngheretics, you can find a place to sign up for the course. We're going to be reading Homer together. We'll also be reading the tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. We'll be reading some comedy, plus a little bit of Hesiod, just a ton of really cool stuff. And I'm so excited to get into lectures and seminars on that at New College, Florida, and grateful and excited to be a part of their team. So I will drop that link also into the show notes. And if you like this show, I guarantee you will have a good time joining my class. If you'd like to, come along and join. There will be other opportunities to do this, but I'm really excited about this fall semester course, Survey in Ancient Greek Literature. Okay, I think that's all the business. Now let's take a mailbag question. Mailbag questions come to me through my Substack, rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And you can find me there. You can DM me. You will get a weekly newsletter from me, and you can also just write back into my email and ask me questions. You got to be a subscriber to ask questions, but it's free to subscribe, and you can pay to support if you would like. So here's a question from Cassandra. Is the, quote, prince abandoned at birth thing an actual archetype? I'm referring to Paris, Oedipus, etc. If so, what does it mean or contribute to our understanding of human life? Thanks. Okay, so Cassandra, it's a very perceptive question because Cassandra's referring to these stories that I've been telling you about the Iliad that kind of surround the Iliad, the stuff that's not in the Iliad but is relevant to it. And one of the things that I mentioned just in passing is this idea that Paris was a shepherd or a shepherd king. And I compared him, I think, at the time to King David. But the fuller story here is that Paris is an example of something we repeatedly get in mythology, and that is the prince abandoned at birth thing, as Cassandra describes it. In TV tropes, there is a name for this. It's called the hidden backup prince, which I love. So the hidden backup prince is the prince that you didn't know about, but who comes in at an important moment of the story, and his noble birthright is revealed. Oedipus is, of course, the classic Greek example of this, the prince abandoned at birth to try to avoid the prophecy, who ends up fulfilling the prophecy in his effort to get out of living out his fate. I would add to this actually a number of other instances from other cultures in order to demonstrate that, yes, I do think this is, in fact, a thing, and not just a particular story pattern that any one particular culture got into, but a more deep-set archetype that we keep coming back to psychologically throughout the history of humanity. And my example, besides Paris and Oedipus, is going to be Moses. Moses is also this sort of guy with a divine destiny in his Jewish ancestry, but ends up abandoned and raised in the house and the country of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter, remember, discovers Moses in this basket of reeds, and he kind of grows up to discover, gradually, have revealed to him through prophecy his divine destiny. And that's kind of a positive version of the Oedipus story. The Oedipus is a negative version, where it turns out that you were doomed to kill your father and marry your mother. In Moses, we get the sort of positive or happy outcome version of it, but it still entails all this struggle and misdirection and discovery. Later on, after the ancient world, we get a bunch of reiterations of this story. There's one in Mort's d'Arthur, which is the Arthurian legend compilation that I've talked about before on the show. I can't get over it. It's always funny to me. The knight's name is Gareth, which is just such a middle management in Slough kind of name these days. But Gareth was the great knight who disguised his own identity in order to prove himself and prove his worth. And I think that last bit, the fact that he did it in order to prove that he truly was deserving, not just by birth, but by merit of knighthood, I think that can help us to understand what this archetype is all about. Because really what it expresses, if you think about it, what it helps us to explore is the disconnect between surface appearance and underlying reality. The fact is, in the world, many people look great, talk great, maybe have a lot of wealth and power and all this stuff that is supposed to be an outward sign of inward nobility. But they're scoundrels, they're knaves, and there's a distinction between kind of natural, real nobility, what Jefferson would have called the natural aristoi, and actual, in practice, nobility. And that disconnection between surface and underlying spirit is kind of the fall, right? It's the disconnect between symbol and symbolized, between outward form and inward grace. And that distance, the further that distance opens up, the more conscious we are of the pilgrimage, the kind of exile that we're in from our true home, where what is outwardly embodied is supposed to represent what's inwardly true. And so the hidden king is kind of all of us. He's a denizen of heaven in exile, cast out into this world where there is no justice and nothing quite makes sense, and where outward forms don't always match up to inward appearances. And the journey that prince takes toward recovering his birthright is a journey toward restoring, in some sense, the union between outward and inward. And sometimes that's tragic, as in the case of Oedipus, where the neglect or the abandonment is an attempt to escape from this terrible kind of cosmic tragedy. And that's, I think, an indicator of the tragic Greek sensibility. But in the Jerusalem side, this actually is a joyous discovery. It's a positive story of our divine birthright, and that is why, and this always happens when you dig deep enough into archetypes, the ultimate fulfillment of the hidden prince narrative is Jesus. So Jesus always turns out to be the embodiment of what all these stories are kind of pointing at, almost as if the whole world was sort of designed with him in mind, and gradually his revelation sort of consummates these story archetypes, because Jesus goes willingly into exile, chooses to take on humanity and enter our fallen world, and gradually is revealed to those around him as the King of Heaven. And that revelation and the faith that emerges out of it is the restoration of the fall. It's the restoration of outward form with inward reality. We still live in the world where the physical symbols of things don't always match up with inner truth and inner virtue, but in the incarnation we have this hint that down the line that will be set to right. So Jesus is the like final form, the final boss form of the myth archetype that we get in Paris, the exiled king, Oedipus, the exiled king, Moses, the exiled prophet. All of that stuff finally comes to a head in Jesus, and we now just basically spin out that story into new and new versions with the knowledge that we're headed toward a reconciliation of outward with inward. Very profound question. Thank you for asking. Always love archetype questions. If you have other archetypes, if you want to write into the archetype hotline about stories that particularly get retold again and again, you can always do that at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. All the links to everything I talked about are going to be in the description of this episode, down below wherever you're listening. Please do rate 5 stars, share the show, let people know about it. That's a huge boon to me and helps me to get the word out about all this stuff. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.